Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Friday Nature series. Great to see a good crowd here. Just so you know, these lectures are hybrid, so there's some people joining online, and they're also recorded, so that we can show them as widely as possible. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Daniela Rey Christen, who is actually a former environmental change management ECM alum from our department. Back in, you're saying 2008 or 2008? Yeah. So it's wonderful to have her back. And since that time, she's been very busy. She has founded and is now director of the Climate Law and Policy organization, which is based here in Oxford, and it works internationally. She's worked with many governments in the private sector on law and policy and implementation. And then she has a particular expertise in issues of safeguarding. Environmental, social, and governance safeguards, an issue that's not received so much attention. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights today, Daniela, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, everyone. It's really lovely, and like I said to Connie, a privilege to be back here. I graduated, over 10 years ago, and like you said, I've been busy. We've been working with over 25 national and national governments on REDD+ and REDD+ safeguards, and do not worry, I'll unpack all these concepts if you're not familiar with us. So without any further review, I'll start the talk. Working?
So slides, try maybe, it's not working, try maybe the pressing down, hit the down button. Right? No, try that one maybe. That'll do it, or the side.
You were just working.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe just click on that. Yeah, something seems to have gotten hung up here. Yes, it is. So maybe let's try and got it. Okay. Yep. Okay, we're good.
Sorry about that. So let's start with some facts and figures. So in 2020, the forest carbon credits that were retired, they only equated to 0.4% of the annual emissions that were coming from tropical and subtropical deforestation. That's tiny in comparison. If we really want to tackle those climate and forest emergencies that we're facing, we need a higher level of ambition that forest projects, particularly on REDD, can actually deliver. Well, this is the massive role that jurisdictional REDD programs can play. And in that sense, unfortunately, even after 10 years of REDD, there's very little progress on the safeguard element. Again, I will unpack this in the next slide. The Warsaw Framework for REDD+ has 5 elements. Those 5 elements are displayed in the slides. As you can see, most of the progress has actually been on the carbon side, on reference levels, with 87%. This is an analysis we've done out of the 64 submissions that have been sent to the UNFCCC Info Hub, which is a platform under the UNFCCC in the Secretary, where they monitor the progress on REDD+. As you see, most of the progress is on reference levels. When we move into the governance and social issues, then we see the fall. On the national REDD strategy, 33%. But when we move into safeguards, particularly the safeguard information system, only 7 out of 64 countries have actually submitted information about the system. And when I mean information, it's just information about design, not actually operational. So that is worrying that we haven't seen that progress. So today, what I want to do, and I'm coming again from a practitioner point of view, I want to share with you what we've learned in the last 10 years.
Slides by that.
Yeah, so, thank you. I got a nice assistant. What I want to share with you is what we learned. Why is it so difficult to move ahead and advance this element of safeguard? What are the challenges? What are the obstacles for those jurisdictions? So this is what I want to share with you. And this is based, like I said, in working with over 26 governments, national and subnational, in tackling these issues. So let's examine what's the need. So in terms of the presentation, like I said, I won't let you down. I will do a definition recap in recognition of the audience. After that, we'll look at the landscape of the REDD finance at jurisdictional REDD scale, which is different from project scale. And we'll look at the specific safeguard requirements that they are setting out. With that context, we will be able to dive into what are the challenges for those jurisdictions in terms of safeguards, because they're responding to what setting out. And finally, I just want to end up with some key takeaways. And on a positive note, really, what are the opportunities to obviously overcome this challenge? So in terms of the UNFCCC REDD Plus, UNFCCC Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus, if you're not familiar with this, the Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus is the consolidated set of decisions under the UNFCCC that sets out all for REDD Plus, including on safeguards. That UNFCCC Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus was adopted in 2013. And in terms of safeguards, it sets out 3 minimum safeguard requirements. And please remember what I'm saying here about minimum. The only is international language. They're setting out 3 minimum things that need to be later unpacked by the REDD finance providers. So exactly how do we implement those requirements, but most importantly, how you verify that you met those requirements. So I'll just walk you through the 3 requirements. First one, the UNFCCC says that REDD activities need to be conformant with the UNFCCC REDD safeguards, those 7 safeguards that they adopted. No other safeguards, those safeguards. Those safeguards are 7 safeguards, and they range a broad set of issues, starting with asking that any REDD action needs to be consistent with international conventions and agreements, and also with the objectives of national forest programs. The second one is more on the governance side. They're asking that it has to be transparent and effective national forest governance structures in the implementation of those REDD actions. The third safeguard is about indigenous peoples. They're asking that you respect both the knowledge and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Safeguard D is about the full and effective participation of all relevant stakeholders, in particular indigenous peoples and local communities. Safeguard E is more about biodiversity. They're asking that any REDD action needs to protect and enhance natural forests and biological diversity. They even say that any REDD action cannot lead to the conversion of natural forests, and even more, that we need to promote and enhance social and environmental benefits. And the last 2 safeguards, which are F and G, and I just combined it for matters of the slide, are more about the carbon accounting side. So they're asking that REDD actions address risk of reversals and displacement of emissions. So there's 7 safeguards. The language is very broad. As you can see, many issues are being encompassed there. And it's a challenge in itself trying to unpack what the safeguards will mean. So to clarify, what are safeguards generally? Safeguards from the traditional point of view are about doing no harm and mitigating any harm if it happens. But in the point of view of the UNFCCC, it's really to go a little bit beyond that. They want you to do good. It's not about just respecting the rights, it's even enhancing or fulfilling those rights, particularly for indigenous peoples. That's the first requirement. The second requirement is having a safeguard information system. A safeguard information system, although it's not defined at the UNFCCC level, is understood to be a domestic institutional arrangement and even a technological platform where the countries can gather the information about how they're reporting on the 7 safeguards and providing that information both to the UNFCCC and domestic. And the third requirement is to provide a summary of information. This is just a reporting requirement towards the UNFCCC. It's a summary that needs to be submitted in the national communication, so every 4 years, or biennial after reports, and also to that info hub. So that's basically the 3 requirements. But I want you to keep in mind, again, the minimum requirements. And here is where the devil's in the details and where we see then the challenges from the finance provider side. So how are we going to meet these requirements? So the landscape, and here I'm only covering the 3 main finance providers who have committed finance. Actual work programs or projects in place, these are the 3 main ones. So the first one is the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, or FCPF. They have a carbon fund where they accepted 15 countries so far, and they have 721 million committed. I'll circle back to them. The second one is the Green Climate Fund, that they've adopted a pilot program for results-based payments. Here, because the Green Climate Fund works through accredited entities, they selected 4 countries that they're going to give the 500 million. And finally, and very different from the first 2, because those are actually finance providers with their own rules and their own funding, the third one is actually a coalition of both public and private sector. You have Amazon and Norway and the UK government there, and they pledged 1 billion. They've already accepted 5 countries in terms of letters of intent, and there's ongoing applications going through you. again, because it's a coalition, they don't set rules. They depend on an external and independent carbon program, which is ART, the Architecture of REDD Transactions, and their own standard, which is called TREES. And bear with me with the acronyms, I know it's a lot, but we'll go slowly. So circling back about the rules, here's where the difficulties lie. So the FCPF, this first one of the World Bank, they adopted what they call the methodological framework. It's basically a document, an indicator on how they're gonna make sure that the countries meet all those requirements that we just saw, and how they're gonna verify them. The key thing as well to mention about the World Bank is that that program is closed now, that pipeline. Those are 15 countries, no more countries can come in, and that continuation is done their analysis, if there's gonna be a new opening for the carbon fund. The Green Climate Fund, here they adopted their own terms of reference and a scorecard. That's also how they're gonna determine what are the requirements in detail and how we're going to verify them, and that program is also closed. There have been 8 countries accepted, continuation is also in their analysis. And finally, LEAF, like I said, depends on this independent carbon program and standard, and that's currently open. They're even now opening new applications that are going. So what are the differences? So this is where it gets exciting. So I get excited. So in terms of the first requirement, that it was, you need to meet the UNFCCC REDD safeguards. How are those finance providers actually aligning themselves or not with those? So the FCPF, and here is in this, I wanted to be more polite, light red, they actually require a different set of safeguards. What they require in terms of compliance is the World Bank safeguards or operational policies, as they call them. So in that sense, you end up with a different set of safeguards. The UNFCCC safeguards under the World Bank are expected to be promoted and supported. That's the exact language. And in practice, and in my experience working with the countries, that translates not too much, because you don't see that the REDD activities or the actions are designed in a way that they integrate the UNFCCC safeguards, and there's no management measures or any monitoring of the UNFCCC safeguards. The GCF is a yellow because they actually require both. They say, apart from UNFCCC, you have to meet the Green Climate Fund's safeguards, the interim safeguards at the moment, because they haven't adopted formally the safeguards for that fund yet. And finally, you have our trees. They actually are completely aligned. They only ask for UNFCCC REDD safeguards. This second row that you see, I know that you can see it at the first slides in terms of requirement, but this is just an unpacking of the first one. So it's not just about, do you ask for the same set of safeguards, it's how you unpack that and how you verify that conformance. So here the FCPF, because they don't require UNFCCC, they don't verify, there's no qualitative assessment of UNFCCC safeguard compliance. GCF in this case, although they ask for it, oddly, they don't do any qualitative assessment, nothing. It's just, you meet them, yes, and that's enough for the GCF. They focus on qualitative assessment of the GCF interim policies. In terms of our trees, here is where our trees is quite interesting, because they have actually unpacked all those 7 safeguards into 16 themes, and these 16 themes have 3 types of indicators: structure, process, and outcome. And with that, they give enough guidance to the countries to be able to understand what is really expected from them, so predictability and clarity, but also how you verify that. What are they going to be verified against? In terms of the second requirement, that having that safeguard information system, the FCPF, again, not aligned, is not asking for this. They only ask for a system where they could keep monitoring the safeguards of the World Bank. GCF does ask for the system, treats the same thing. And in terms of the submission of information, FCPF doesn't ask for this. They only ask for monitoring reports on safeguards related to the World Bank, and GCF does ask for this. So this is where you see those reds and greens, and this, as you can probably already assume, presents challenges for the jurisdiction. So let's examine those in more detail. Thank you. So the 2 main challenges, there's some seats here. There are 2 main challenges for the jurisdictions. The first, and as you can imagine for the red-green table, is navigating the multiple and sometimes overlapping requirements. And we'll look at this into the next slides. The second one is for these jurisdictions to have the ability of being in a position to take a more sort of programmatic and integrated approach to dealing with the safeguards rather than a piecemeal approach, which has been ineffective in terms of leading them to be able to meet the safeguards, but also report those. And we'll also examine that challenge in more detail. So the first challenge, as you saw, in many cases, countries are facing having to meet the UNFCCC REDD safeguards, which are the minimum, but then they go to another finance providers and they ask, no, instead of that, you need to meet this or both, or three sometimes. Same thing with the monitoring aspects. They might not need to have a safeguard information system, but they need a complete different system. And in terms of reporting, the same thing. And I'm going to illustrate this for you visually with the countries who are participating in the different finance providers. So these are all the countries who are engaged in the different finance providers. And this is where you see the intersections. So I want you to understand from practical point of view, we have countries like Nepal, Ghana, Vietnam, Costa Rica, who are participating both in FCPF and R3s, UNFCCC safeguards, World Bank safeguards, having to deal with not having that safeguard information system, but now having to do gap filling later on. Same thing with the summaries. So it's a struggle for the jurisdiction really to be able to navigate this. I mean, it's a lot of technical, a lot of resources that need to go into this. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing from the jurisdictions is that we are almost undermining their ability to be able to meet the minimum requirements, and increased transactional costs are completely unnecessary. So this is a critical challenge for the jurisdictions nowadays. The second challenge is this programmatic approach that I'm alluding to. So as you saw, there are 3 safeguard requirements, but to meet those, you need building blocks. And those building blocks are issues that intersect and allow you to implement the safeguards. To start with, you have, how do I implement the safeguards at a government level, at that scale, even a country like Brazil or Mexico? So the first thing is about implementing the safeguards through laws, policies, and regulations. And we'll look into that. We'll do a deep dive on that. The second building block is benefit sharing. The third one is GRM, so grievance redress mechanisms. Then we have, and very important throughout everything, is the meaningful consultation and engagement of indigenous peoples and local communities. That means a lot of steps need to be taken to set up adequate platforms, but also to engage them throughout. Then is the safeguard information system and the summary. So they all intersect, they're all interconnected. And the problem that jurisdictions have faced so far is that they've been receiving piecemeal technical assistance and little funding for this, little funding for that, but nothing really in a programmatic, holistic, cohesive manner that allows them to be able to put all these building blocks in place. And ultimately, like we said, actually being able to implement those safeguards and report adequately on them. So let's do the first deep dive on the policy, laws, and regulations. So this is my bread and butter. I'm a lawyer by training. So why policy, laws, and regulations, you might ask yourself. So for countries, for governments, implementing safeguards, the thing that makes most sense to them is to use their own governance system. And by that usually means their own legal system. So what does my constitution say? My relevant laws, policies, regulations, plans, programs, as well as the institutional arrangements, the institutions who are in charge of implementing such legislation. So for them, it's the most cost-effective and makes more sense. Plus, it's enforceable, which is also key. Central steps in terms of being able to implement safeguards through those governance arrangements is first clarifying what those 7 safeguards mean to the country context. So I want to walk you through that process. And the second one is, yes, I have all these laws, policies, and regulations, but are they good enough? So this next step or next challenge for the jurisdictions is, how do I strengthen, how I do the gap filling, and what processes and complexities go around that specific process. So clarifying safeguards to national circumstances. Like I was saying, the 7 safeguards are international legal language. Just like the standards like R3s has done in terms of unpacking them, the same expectations is from the countries. So the 7 safeguards, that language, what the countries are expected to do is to clarify what it means to the country context. They generally rely on their own legislation to understand what that means. And here, this is just a slide to give you a flavor of that, because it can be that indigenous peoples is recognized by many countries, but in other countries, that term is not used, and they actually are protecting another vulnerable group. So unpacking, clarifying these safeguards is really determining the scope, what am I committing to? And that's really critical for the jurisdictions. No, I can't sign on to protecting indigenous peoples in a country where there's no indigenous people, for example. So Mexico, for example, they recognized that it was not just indigenous peoples at the vulnerable group, for them it's ejidos and communities. Whilst in Vietnam, they don't recognize indigenous peoples, not a term they use ethnic minorities, and that is the group that they are trying to protect through the safeguard. Papua New Guinea is more customary landowners. So it really differs, and I just want you to understand that how you clarify the safeguards really varies a lot from country to country and region to region. All the countries have been encouraged to do this clarification, and they've all been sending it to the UNFCCC in their summaries of information. That is a central piece of information that has been submitted so far, and how they would implement it. The reporting definition, but we'll come back to that. In terms of strengthening those PLRs, like I said, no country is perfect. You would always have gaps you need to strengthen. Jurisdiction so far is how do I go about this process? So what is politically and timely feasible? It can take 5 years or more to actually get a legal reform. So for a lot of countries, they need to understand and unpack, do I have enough political capital to move this through? You have to be mindful that a lot of the agencies who are leading REDD+ are climate change or environmental ministries. So they don't have powers to amend the law on indigenous peoples or other areas. So it's difficult for them to push. They perhaps need to take more of an opportunistic approach. Sometimes when there are legal amendments are planned, they try to fit them in. So it takes time, energy, and a lot of political capital for these ministries to be able to move this forward. The second question that they ask is, instead of a legal reform, can I just adopt what they call secondary legislation? So can I adopt a guidance, a manual, a code of conduct that I can use? The problem for them in that sense is that that would apply only to that ministry. And in the case of REDD, there's other government agencies that need to intersect and interact with them. So they need to make sure that the other ones have something equally good. So that is also a complex process. And finally, yes, you can have very good laws in paper, but it's the practice really that matters. So it's about strengthening the mandates and the capacities and the budgets of those institutions, ministries who are going to be in charge of implementing that. In many cases, like if it's a climate or environmental ministry, they won't have experts on grievance redress mechanism or in benefit sharing, and they need to bring them in. So it is hard, and like I said, resources are scarce for the jurisdictions, and sometimes it's a team of 1 or 2 people. So it is hard for them to be able to navigate in terms of strengthening and putting all the system in place to adequately then implement the safeguards. The second deep dive that I want to take about these building blocks that need to be there is about the safeguard information system. So that is the other interesting challenge that the jurisdictions are facing. So the safeguard information system, as a reminder again, is this understood to be this domestic institutional technological solution. There's no guidance from the UNFCCC what the system is supposed to be. There's no guidance also from the finance providers. They just want a safeguard information system. So for the countries, they have to be unpacking throughout the years. What does this mean? What do I need to do? And the best practices so far they have been incorporating is those 4 main elements. The first one is objectives. Who am I reporting to? Is it just the UNFCCC? Am I reporting to my national constituencies? Am I reporting to the funders and donors? Those are all conversations that they need to have, because that will have an impact on how they design the system. Because of frequency, do I need to do every year or every 6 months? How am I going to disseminate the information? Is it just online, or do I need to tailor it to indigenous peoples and I need cultural mediators? So there's a lot of unraveling that they have to go through. Then we have the sources. Where will I get this information from? Will I rely on existing information systems? That's what most countries thought they could do. But then they realized that information is aggregated, it's very general, it's very broad. For example, reports on human rights or indigenous people's rights. So it's not tailored to the REDD action per se. And what we want to know is how you respect it, that is specific right of indigenous peoples in relation to the REDD action, in the scope of that REDD action. So that's been hard for them. And they've realized that a lot of the information they have to gather almost manually. They have to go and record and collect that information. So it's more of a burden. The third one is indicators, and this is very tricky for them. So indicators is the types of information that they will be providing. In types of information, they've learned that they have to do 2 things. Types of information about their capacity. So am I capable? Do I have the system? Do I have my policy, law, regulations in place? And the tricky one is outcomes, the actual people were consulted, how many species were protected. This is where they haven't gotten to that so far. And it's an expectation of the finance providers that they need to provide that information. This is where a lot of jurisdictions are actually stuck at the moment. And finally, we have functions and institutional arrangements. This is what we do and who does it. So who is going to be collecting the information, who's going to be, part of analyzing the information and disseminating. Here is the complexities are how much involvement you get from indigenous peoples, local communities, and any relevant stakeholders in that entire process, how many ministries or agencies need to be involved. So it's very complex sort of, multi-sectorial sort of platforms are being set up, and also how you also collect information from projects subnationally and nationally. So there's so many layers and intersections that they need to set up in terms of that platform and the functions and the institutional arrangement. So this slide is just to give you of taking that programmatic approach, but also how it pays up. So Mexico, it was one of the pioneering countries in terms of REDD+. They developed what they call themselves a national safeguard system and a safeguard information system. And you see from this slide, the process that they took and all how these building blocks intersect. The national REDD strategy started in 2010, and immediately after they started identifying that policies, laws, and regulations that we're going to use to implement the safeguards. This was a very lengthy process that you can see from the tab, basically because they did a lot of legal reforms. They took advantage of this process and adopted new laws in indigenous peoples, for example, but that took years. They took this also down to the states and piloted with 5 states. That PLR analysis was used to do that clarification of the safeguards, as I mentioned. And that in itself led to defining indicators. So now that we determine what we're committing, what are we going to report to? That also intersected with the setting up of the grievance redress mechanism. And all of this fed into what they call their safeguard information system and the national safeguard system. So the national safeguard system for them is all the pillars to ensure implementation. And then the information is about information and reporting. So basically, this took them about 7 years, as you can see. And they had a lot of financial and technical resources coming up from different entities. Most of the countries are not as lucky as Mexico. So this is just to illustrate that chapter. So key takeaways from today and the opportunities. As you saw, safeguards is the least progressed element under the Warsaw Framework. The challenges are huge for the jurisdiction to be able to meet that. And they see it as a central requirement, but I think generally now there's an understanding that safeguards are not an afterthought. They are a requirement as important as reference. And we really need to tackle it. Not just because of doing no harm, because of the potential that it has for doing good. The main obstacles that they're facing is this multiple overlapping, sometimes inconsistent set of requirements, and the fact that they're not in a position, like I said, in many cases due to financial and technical constraints, to take a more sort of programmatic approach, like the example that I gave you from Mexico, that enable them to really tackle these issues. The opportunities to overcome this is that we see that there's a huge, very strong political will and interest from the jurisdiction to tackle these issues. Like I said, safeguards stop being this afterthought, and they're seen as, yes, we need to do this and we want to do this. Financial and technical assistance sort of dried out, but we're seeing there's a new renewed interest from the donors to really support the jurisdictions dealing with these issues. They realize how much this element has been left behind. And the third sort of opportunity is that this application of that methodological, methodological guidance of the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, I think there's now a common understanding of how critical it is for the effectiveness and the coordination of REDD+ finance. And their key opportunities, like I said, the FCPF, the Carbon Fund is under review, is under analysis. There's a potential that we can review the methodological framework and make sure that it's more aligned with the Warsaw Framework. The GCF pilot program is under analysis, and it should be, a decision about renewal should be next year. And there's also a possibility then to ensure more alignment with the Warsaw Framework. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks for an excellent whirlwind tour and update of what's going on the safeguards front. And now there should be lots of time for questions, so maybe we'll stop this screen share. Questions from the audience here, and then I'll be trying to monitor the chat and we'll take a few there and go back and forth and see where that goes. Great, so maybe do you want to call on people and then maybe repeat the question so they can, yeah, excellent. Okay.
Hi.
I'm not sure if they're questions, but I have two extremely half-baked thoughts that come from this that I'd be interested to get, your sort of take on. I suppose one is, does this sort of lead towards sort of implying that actually right now, or without a lot more sort of thought at the funder level, that jurisdictional is just very hard, and that actually well-funded project-based approaches would be a better way forward, certainly in this interim, while I think some of the work goes on in the background. And another extremely half-baked thought is to whether there's the ability at funder level to actually, particularly I was thinking more that that's the top end of the policy, legal, regulatory, as it flows down. So almost to create almost like a sort of a set of turnkey solutions that can be adapted with more speed. Do you see what I mean? Instead of sort of dropping these requirements and then go, oh, you can figure it out. Yeah. And walking away is actually doing some of that pre-thinking and offering solutions. Yeah. So again, I recognize this is, as I say, very half-baked.
No, that's good. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, question and a comment. The first question is, because the picture that you're showing is really familiar from all kinds of fields of kind of international initiatives, international development, where massively overloads the global south countries with reporting requirements and paperwork. This is like a kind of recurring problem. And so I get the fact that there's a lot of paperwork replication, process replication in it. But the question part is, especially the outlining, how much of the actual content of what you would have to produce in FCPA could you basically move across and repackage in a different way? Like, are they?
So what I was saying,
yeah. Are they specifically different in their guts, or is it just the way they have to be packaged?
Yeah.
Which therefore kind of creates a sort of different solution. And I think just to do a bit more baking on your first comment, which I think is a really good comment. I mean, I think can one leverage the kind of approach that FSC have in sustainable forestry, which is that you can develop an interim national, standard around a particular project.
Yeah.
And then that does do that project, and whether you now fully adopt that as the national standard or rework it, but as the national standard is a different question. But they have this INS interim thing, which serves that.
Nice baking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Take another question. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions connected to this discussion actually. Similar. Drawing from the project-based sort of conversation also, I mean, where would this kind of complexity of the safeguards fit into, for example, if you have safeguards for legal policies for countries themselves, not just the projects, but the policies that are being created or legal changes that are happening to constitutions, as well as regional rather than project-based safeguards. So how do we, because that makes it even more complex to on top of what it already is. But I think in the same sort of thing, if we're looking at the DRM mechanisms, how do we, I think my question was like, how do we, is there a space to give more importance to the GRM mechanism within this entire framework to begin with? And how would that work if you mentioned it's so complex right now? So would that mean we should move towards a unified or like a universal sort of harmonized framework, or would that mean we need to break it down more into local sort of control or authority over the way the frameworks are working? Right? Yeah. Sorry, it's a long question, but
yeah, that's good. And then we have one at least online. So
Yeah.
maybe start with this.
Maybe start. Okay. So it's yeah, they can see us. Yeah, with jurisdictional, harder. It's perhaps easier to do with projects, like you said. I mean, I think the answer is like we need the scale of jurisdictional REDD programs that we were saying. Like if we want to tackle that climate and both deforestation emergencies, the project level REDD plus projects are not enough. So I think we have to keep that in mind. It's definitely harder at jurisdictional level. There are more complexities, project level, particularly in safeguards. You do a risk assessment, you identify the safeguards, you're closer to the community, you can deal with those issues more. But at the scale of Brazil, Mexico, there are inherent complexities. So I'm with you. I think it is harder, but we just can't give up, I guess, that's.
I suppose it's almost like
Yeah.
the sort of project base can be interim on which you build while we wait. After actually.
Well, it is happening exactly like you're saying. So we are moving away, we're moving ahead with projects. They're not gonna stop, they're gonna continue. But I think my message and the general message, I think from the finance community as well, is that we need to put more money into jurisdictional REDD too. Because, you know, we haven't invested as much and we really need to make it happen just for the matter of scale. In terms of more guidance on sort of PLRs, you said?
I sort of, and he built on it, was the idea of some more almost turnkey solutions for, I mean, you spoke about it, you know, for some of these, for example, the SIS and
Yeah.
stuff like that, even at
Yes.
the regulatory level, that can be taken and adapted. So a bit more investment there at the funders level to then make it much more, so seamless with a big laugh, but you know, actually dealable with.
Yeah, so there are a lot of tools and guidance that has been usually developed by UNRED, the UNRED or the UN agencies to help with this. Some of them funded by the main finance providers. But I think what the jurisdictions are actually struggling is implementing that guidance to the country context. So that is really what's sorely missing, is that TA that is directed and tailored to the country need. So I think guidance we have is just not the specific technical assistance in the country that's missing. In terms of the FCPF question about how or to what extent can we move across what we've done in the FCPF towards other standards and other finance providers? Excellent question. So the FCPF, because they use the World Bank safeguards and the modality of the World Bank, what they do is a risk assessment. So they go to the countries and assess the risk, and based on the risk, there's safeguards that are triggered under the World Bank. So those can be 2 safeguards, 3 safeguards, 5 safeguards. They don't necessarily correlate to the 7 safeguards of the UNFCCC. So now you follow. So that is a challenge for them because those trigger safeguards might not cover all the 7 safeguards of the UNFCCC. So that's the struggle for the countries, is that gap filling maybe. But they can use the risk assessments and the management plans and they use that and translate that. But it's that challenge of translating it and the gap filling for the jurisdictions. On the GRMs, yes, so it has received a lot of importance in the last 2-3 years. It's actually even a specific requirement from the finance providers now, the standard. They ask you to have a grievance redress mechanism up in place at project level and at jurisdictional level. So yeah, it's about how you set that up, because as you know, they can't replace sort of judicial systems in the country. So they have to set up some sort of administrative structure that they could deal with, you know, in a more accessible way for local communities on how they can sort of place any complaint or even feedback about the plus.
Great. So yeah, let's follow with a question from online by Misha Lepetic, which might be referring to project level, but let's see what you think. It says, what obligations do project developers have to provide this data and or systems as part of their project design documentation?
Okay. So as we know, in REDD+, when they're designing those REDD programs at the jurisdictional level, they're trying to make sure that we nest the projects under that. Nesting means both from their carbon accounting side, but also from the safeguard side. So in that case, in some countries, because not in all countries, the government is giving guidance to the project level activities of what they would expect in terms of information, exactly like that. So they would expect that project developers on REDD+ do gather information that will feed into the safeguard information system. But that is not happening on every country. That's only more advanced countries, like, for example, Mexico.
Thanks. Let's see. Well, I guess we can take 2 from here and then move. Okay, so this is Oda Almas from Forest Peoples Program. I'm interested specifically in the verification of the compliance with safeguard requirements. I know the verification system of trees best, and it seems like there are problems in terms of how to ensure that the information used by verification bodies is grounded, that is triangulated through actually talking to people on the ground.
Yeah.
Are there comprehensive independent verification systems within FCPF and GCF?
Okay, excellent question. This is the heart of the details. So our trees, yes, they're the only program or standard in this case that actually has a validation and verification process. FCPF and GCF, they don't do that. Not for UNCCC safeguards. They only cover the World Bank or the GCF safeguards. So UNCCC are left out of those. I don't know if that answers the question, but the trouble or like I said, the main challenge for both the jurisdictions and now the validating bodies under those standards is getting the information about impacts outcomes, like I was saying. So they're able at the moment and in this crediting period, like they call it under R3s, they're able to get information about the capacity of the jurisdictions to meet the safeguards. So they're getting all the list of every single piece of legislation and institutional arrangements that there is for every single safeguard. So how am I going to conserve natural forests, or how am I protecting IPs? But how did I actually do that? Like the results, that's what's missing now. And R3s is expecting or requiring the jurisdictions to do that for the next crediting period. Just in recognition that this is a phased approach, R3s was only adopted in 2021. So the rules of the game are only clear very recently for jurisdictions, and they haven't been compiling that information, to be fair. So that is a tricky moment that we are at the validation and verification.
Okay. So I think we can take some more, maybe 2 or 3 more from the audience.
To what extent is free, prior and informed consent FPIC
Yeah.
legislation and practice considered as part of that Indigenous peoples and local community safeguard?
Yes, excellent question. So it is part of that safeguard on the respect of the rights and knowledge of Indigenous peoples. FPIC is one of the first sort of components that comes up for countries. And yes, there are countries who actually have protocols, guidelines on FPIC. I haven't seen a country who has actual legislation, but more protocols and guidelines on how they're going to comply that. But in terms of enforcing FPIC, some countries have, as part of the legislation, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and FPIC is recognized legally. Not how to do it, but the right of FPIC, that we have to conduct FPIC in certain circumstances.
When you talk to Indigenous peoples leaders, yes, there's the FPIC guidelines, but what are the chances of it actually being, followed and implemented properly?
Yeah.
So
it's a good question. I mean, I guess at a project level, it depends how much supervision you have over the project. I mean, you have obviously auditors who come and look at the projects and they try to make sure that FPIC actually was conducted. In the case of the jurisdictional programs, like I said, at least R3s is the only one who's setting up a verification procedure. They haven't done audits yet. They haven't gone to the field so far, as I'm aware, because they've only sort of got concept notes so far under R3s. But they would need to verify if FPIC was conducted. That is part of the FPIC features in R3s as part of one of the indicators. So I don't think they can get away with not doing it if they want the money through R3s. Yes.
I'm pretty sure this is a super naive question. I'm sorry. So what at project levels, for example, if auditors come and find that some safeguards have been violated several years into the project, what kind of remedial action can be taken to recover a project or enforce the revival of so adaptive management to ensure that those safeguards are subsequently adhered to?
So this is a case where the violations happen in the past.
Oh no, I'm saying so. Let's assume a project starts this year, and in 3 years' time, it's found that the project relationships with local Indigenous people has deteriorated and no longer meet safeguard requirements.
Okay.
What kind of remedial action can be taken?
Yeah. So in this case, in projects, what they do is adopt management measures. So they need to follow those through the implementation of that project. Management measures can cover issues like Indigenous people's rights. So if those management plans are not followed, then the auditors will come and raise questions to the project. Exactly how that would be penalized would depend on the contractual arrangements that you have with the project.
Is there any precedent in, say, freezing payments projects that end up underperforming?
Not that I'm aware.
So,
but I think honestly, a lot of that information is private because a lot of the buyers, off-takers who take those carbon credits might not disclose that information publicly. I mean, they might deal with it directly with the project. So if they withheld payments or took any sort of action, it will be sort of a contractual issue between two parties, not something that perhaps we will be aware of.
so I I work a lot in biodiversity markets where compliance failures are rife, that's just totally right. And there's extremely limited evidence of any kind of enforcement action. Actually.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's just like such a power mismatch that it's almost impossible to take enforcement action in situations that have invested so much in governance for many years. It's impossible to almost recognize that projects have failed.
Yeah.
What's your reflection on that? Like, if it's unambiguous in 5 years' time that these projects are failing, do we keep on trying, or do we try to remember it?
Well, I think you have to stop investing in a project is failing, particularly on safeguards. But I mean, what I would say is that one of the shortcomings that I see from the private certification standards, like in these projects, is that they do audits usually every 5 years. So a lot can happen in 5 years. So you need more sort of annual, more regular monitoring, exactly to pick up those issues that you're saying. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any examples that I could share. There are a few people I can introduce you in the crowd who work at project level, and they can share their experience. So I'll make sure that you meet them later. Yes. Wait, maybe the one in the back?
Yeah, one more, then one online,
Okay.
and then we'll go back to the room. Yeah.
Maybe following up on that, how does that sort of match the conversation match with result-based payments?
Yeah.
Like, how is that, is that something that result-based payments are still being made even when the results are not there?
Yes, I like your question.
Also at jurisdictional level or just at project level?
So let me answer this question because it's complicated. I even thought about bringing a slide on this, but the complexity about the ex post nature of results-based payments is that you are trying to check for actions that happened 5 years ago. And when those countries, like I said, didn't have indicators, they weren't collecting the data, what assurance that you have that the actual, those outcomes were good and no harm was done? Exactly. So it is a challenge for the auditors today. So that is a challenge for the verification bodies. Ground and make almost an investigation of what's happened in the last 5 years. So that is tricky. I think that happens both at project and jurisdictional level, but jurisdictional level probably is a higher challenge, a bigger challenge because of the scale of trying to find all that information. Yes.
Oh, sorry, here,
this
one
first?
here,
Yeah,
and then we'll go forward. So I'll try to summarize it. A great presentation about the potential implications of carbon prospectors that are hastily developing contracts. They seem to be precluding pathways to the development of jurisdictional REDD+ and may have implications for safeguards. How can we address this trend? Secondly, has Daniela been able to look at VCS jurisdictional nested REDD+ as part of your analysis? Yeah.
Yes. So I don't know if I got the first part of the question about carbon prospectors.
Just the concern that they're undermining the system, I think, essentially. And if it says, how is it best to address that trend of, is it?
I think I would fail in answering that bit because I don't see that they're undermining the jurisdictional.
You don't
so
see them
far.
doing that?
No,
Okay.
no, I think like we said, there's a place for both projects and jurisdictional.
But at carbon, I think when they said carbon prospectors, they meant more the cowboy, that sort of,
Of course.
Yeah.
Everything puts a risk of reputation of REDD.
Yeah.
So, we want to make sure that things are done right. Like I said, size matters, but we need to do this right. And obviously, with some projects, there's a lot of risk. I mean, there's a lot of countries that have put sort of moratoriums on some sort of, projects going ahead, like PNG, they put a stop on any REDD project at the moment until they decided how they want to proceed at jurisdictional level and set all the rules of what every project had to comply beyond just Ken says. So that's a way sort of protecting them, I guess. On the other one, on VCS, JNR, yes, we have analyzed and compared it. There are several gaps. If they're interested, we did a submission to the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market, who's supposed to regulate all the carbon programs, and we mapped out all those gaps so that they could hopefully address them and give more sort of rules to the carbon programs that are working.
Would that be mapping the gaps between the JNR and whose system, the art trees?
Yeah, so
okay.
the carbon programs that are out there at the moment is art trees,
Yeah.
VCS JNR, REDD+, which doesn't have any rules. And some people compare the FCPF do that as well, but I don't consider a standard. So it's only those three at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Back to
Yeah.
Two sort of follow-up questions. The first one is based on the violations. So in terms of addressing violations, there's many countries, for example, at least in India, there's a shift from a criminal sort of violations punishment or penalty towards a more financial base. So they're moving away from jail terms and moving towards paying off the violations of certain amounts of money. And I just wanted to ask, like, in your opinion, what sort of seems to be working and what might be a better step for countries to be taking in terms of violations. And the other question I had was in terms of the kind of complexity that you spoke about regarding the number of safeguards that there are, the various levels of safeguards that countries have, jurisdictions have to address. Would it be better to move towards a more like simplified and harmonized framework internationally, or would it be more effective to move towards like a localized framework system based on regions, jurisdictions? Yeah.
Okay, excellent questions. So on the first one, in terms of steps and perhaps best practices, no, in terms of dealing with violations,
Right.
yeah. I think honestly, it depends a lot of the country context. So it's how they customarily use and deal with these things. So I've seen many countries like you're describing that are both taking sort of financial penalties, but also jail time for doing these things. A lot of it for cutting forests, natural forests that they shouldn't, or like you said, perhaps violating even rights. In terms of the simplified sort of harmonized framework, I mean, that was the intention of the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, is to set up those rules that were supposed to be applied by everyone. I mean, the UNFCCC, you know, is setting this out for any body that works under the UNFCCC. So the Green Climate Fund, to be fair, and I've been, and I'm not afraid to tell because I've told them to their faces. But you know, the UNFCCC cannot go beyond that. I mean, they can only encourage, and that is the language that they actually use, the FCPF, for example, or any other finance provider. So it's their decision if they can be 100% aligned or not. But at the end of the day, FCPF, other funders, they depend on donors, and the donors are the ones who want to see sort of effectiveness and delivery. So maybe, like I said, there are opportunities, and I'm hoping the donors are hearing me, that they would require some sort of revisions to that methodological framework and also the GCF. Because like you said, I mean, we need that that sort of harmonized approach to facilitate. Why are we making it even more difficult? It's not that we're lowering the bar, not at all. We're just making sure that we can meet a high bar, but in one sort of path, no? Yes.
You described that it's a long process for a country to put all the systems in place, and you gave the example of Mexico that took 7 years and then managed to successfully put the systems in place. So I wondered whether you've encountered cases of countries where those that process maybe regressed as well, was vulnerable to political vagaries, like changes of government or
I'm very glad that you asked that question. Yeah, there are a few examples. So even Mexico. So they reached that point, they set up everything, and then there was a change of government, and everyone that was in the CONAFOR, the Commission on Natural Forestry, was in charge of this, left. So now the system is designed, they even have databases, everything, no one is working on that. It's been dropped. So yes, like you said, I mean, that is the thing, you know, it's political changes can change everything for the country, sadly. And I don't have an answer how you would fix that. I mean, at the end of the day, what I do like about the approach of the jurisdictions is about using those policies, laws, and regulation, because those changes that they did to the laws and adopted new laws on indigenous people, those are there. They can't change that. But yeah, in terms of institutional arrangements, who's responsible, budget, that all changes day to day, unfortunately. Okay. Yes.
When you generate the carbon credit, you always go against a baseline.
Yeah.
And the additionality and leakage and all of these things are important. But the same should actually or could also apply to the safeguards. Because safeguards, as I understood, currently is just a comparison to status quo. rather against a baseline. Because if the baseline changes because the government comes in, harms indigenous people, then you actually put in additional measures, but you're actually the status quo being the course, and so you actually did a lot of good, but you're penalized because you're below the bar.
Interesting. Difficult question, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think because we start with assessing the capacity of the jurisdiction, so that is the baseline starting point. Anything that we see in terms of improvements, like I said, a new law on indigenous peoples or a new law to protect natural forests, then they see it as an improvement, no? And that is against what they're measuring, like you said, that performance. But in terms of like we said, more accurate indicators, like quantitative indicators that countries are starting to try to set down and commit to based on their capacities, budgets, and everything, and political will, like we said, then I think then we can see more tangibly actual progress, and we can better sort of measure, but we are not there yet.
But just to if you would generate positive social and, let's say, biodiversity outcomes, you could actually sell these additional outcomes as ecosystem services or whatever.
That's a plus.
As a
Yes.
plus.
Yeah. I'm glad you say.
So in a way, it would be good to develop this rather than sticking to this more static approach.
Yeah, no, you're right. At the project level, some of the projects get additional pricing or better pricing when they have those additional impacts or benefits. So those are more sort of taken account at a project level. At the jurisdictional level, not yet, at least.
I was thinking about a sort of world with limited resources and problems and political instability. How do you make a system more robust? So I wanted to ask about your experience when you've been working on carbon. Have you seen, what have you seen with other institutions working on the other ecosystem services from nature? So there's this whole drive of natural capital accounting and looking at natural capital more holistically. Is the carbon community learning from what's being applied to safeguards in water or safeguards in biodiversity or safeguards in soil erosion? Are we coming together in ways that we save money by looking at things more holistically and not just focusing on carbon?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess a lot of the best practices have been drawn from other experiences, like you said. A lot of them come actually from the development sector. So social safeguards, they're trying to look at those sort of investments and what you can take out from that. But from other nature-based solutions, maybe. Yeah, I mean, they draw examples, but at the end of the day, like I said, the minimum requirements are coming out from the UNFCCC. So those 7 safeguards, like we said, perhaps how you interpret, unpack them, implement them, validate and verify them, they're trying to get examples from other sectors. But I couldn't tell you if they've done any analysis or a mapping, or I haven't seen any country who has been using other sort of system under other schemes to try to sort of meet the safeguards. The only thing is that on biodiversity, a lot of the countries are using the work under the Biodiversity Convention, the HITARIES, and using that to sort of unpack how they will meet their biodiversity safeguards under REDD. And they try, like you said, to make it more sort of integrated, cohesive, harmonized in that way, and use whatever they do for dual reporting. But beyond that, I don't have any other examples. I mean, human rights, indigenous peoples, sort of, but I think it's so particular, the challenges around REDD+ for those groups, that it's almost a bit difficult, I guess, to extract lessons from other areas.
I have lots of questions, but I was trying to decide which one, but thanks. This was really excellent presentation, excellent questions and answers. Really enjoyed it. I mean, this is maybe one big sort of step back question might be how just about the whole concept of using safeguards to achieve, what I think they're attempting to achieve as spelled out in the Warsaw Framework, et cetera, or Cancun Agreement, et cetera. So is it possible to imagine a scenario of REDD+ safeguards in countries where there are known to be or felt to be by many different political and non-political figures, fundamental challenges with human rights, democracy, sort of basic governance challenges, which in some ways, though, I mean, to be fair, might describe almost every country to a degree, right? You know, so, you know, how, and it's sort of a catch-22, because I guess one argument is that, well, at least the safeguards might be an incentive to try to improve things, assuming that REDD+ money, et cetera, is enough incentive to actually change those kinds of major political dynamics. But at the same time, if not, then are they just sort of justifying continuing business as usual and sort of legitimizing it? Yeah, yeah.
No, good question. So yes, I mean, there are countries where you think, really, are they going to commit to this, implement this? I also have personal doubts with a lot of countries, but at the end of the day, I mean, those results-based payments are conditional to the performance on those safeguards at the end of the day. So it's really about the pressure that we're putting on those validating, verifying bodies, if they're going to do the excellent job that we expect in terms of, you know, unpacking, did they respect those safeguards, do those outcomes actually happen? I think we will know if those countries, you know, are doing what they should be doing. But I think we will see countries that perhaps won't be able to reach those impacts and those outcomes, and they might not be able to receive those results-based payments. But I haven't got to the stage, or I haven't seen our countries got to the stage.
Yeah, because it's interesting that, I mean, until now, it doesn't sound like the results-based payments have not been particularly hindered by the safeguards. Yeah. So.
Well, to be fair, a lot of money is being committed. It hasn't actually been dispersed for a lot of the countries. Yeah. And it's all set to some conditionalities, particularly on safeguards, so that, you know, a lot of the conditionalities are on grievance redress mechanisms, on benefit sharing, because they don't have those systems in place. So we will have to see, like I said, how those validated, are they going to be flexible, or are they going to stick and be stringent and say, you don't have it, so you're not getting the results-based finance? So that's when it's going to be a tricky conversation. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, any more questions? Finally, but we can carry on the conversation over drinks.
Yes.
And first, but thank you so much,
No,
Daniela. Excellent.
thank you. We don't really message about the recording.
Oh, well, that's was during the question and answer, I think, wasn't it? Because I think that was key. Oh, that's probably because it ran out. So I didn't see anything about recording.